Hey guys, imagine you're curled up in a half-collapsed thatch hut at midnight, the frost biting your nose like a jealous ex, while a rooster's angry cluck echoes from the next village. Welcome to medieval winter survival, the original cold cardio you never signed up for. Before we freeze our brains, smash that like button if you love a good shiver, and drop a comment telling us the coldest night you've ever survived. Bonus points for weird socks. Dim the lights. Grab a blanket that's definitely not made of rabbit fur. And let's pretend the drafty stone floor is the only thing between you and a hypothermic apocalypse. You hear the crackle of a peat fire fighting a gust of wind that smells like damp wool and goat cheese. Feel the rough, splintered wooden beam press against your back as you huddle with a sack of barley that's half cooked and half hope. It's darkly funny how peasants turned straw, animal skins, and a pinch of superstition into a life support system. Think of it as the medieval version of your modern-day thermostat broken, and you resorting to 3 layers of fleece and a strong coffee. If you ever thought your current cold snap was brutal, compare it to a night when a single frozen pond could double as a morgue, and every sneeze threatened a pneumonia audition. So tell me, would you trade your heating bill for a night of shivering under a goat hair blanket? High above the lowlands, the Eldra Highlands stretch like a frost-bitten quilt, its jagged peaks stabbing the heavens with icy blades. The wind whistles through the stone cottages, carrying the sour scent of frozen pine sap and the occasional whiff of goat cheese gone bad. Dawn cracks open a sky so white it looks like a freshly printed comic book panel, blank, stark, and waiting for a splash of color. Villagers huddle in their homes, sipping broth that steams like a dragon's sneeze, while the sun, if you can call a pale, trembling disk that offers no mercy. Mara, the village's youngest weaver, darts through the market square with a bundle of half-finished wool rolls tangled like a plot twist in a soap opera. Her fingers, calloused from years of shuttle work, curl around the loom as if it were a stubborn cat she refuses to put down. She jokes that her shawls are as warm as a Netflix binge on a rainy Sunday, though the jokes feel as thin as the fabric she pulls from the skein. Elder Torin watches from his cracked porch, his beard frosted like a snow-capped mountain, and his eyes sharp enough to spot a stray mouse in a blizzard. When the first brutal freeze hits, the wind turns malevolent, rattling the shutters like a bad karaoke night in a tavern. The village's single communal shawl, Mara's prideful creation, flutters uselessly, a bright splash of color lost in a sea of white. It shivers under the gale, each stitch screaming, "I'm not a superhero," as if expecting to swoop in like a cape-clad crusader. Frost bites into exposed skin, making noses turn a shade of red that would make a lobster blush, and the villagers gasp, clutching at thin layers that feel as if they were woven from spider silk and hope. Torun, the elder, steps forward with a grin as crooked as the village's weathered fence and declares, "We need more layers, my friends. Think of it as a medieval Power Rangers outfit, but with wool." He rummages through the communal storehouse, pulling out old sheepskin blankets, rough spun linen shirts, and even a sack of horsehair for insulation. The peasants scramble, slipping on garments like actors, auditioning for a costume drama. The scent of sweat, wool, and pine mingling into a perfume no one would dare wear to a royal ball. Laughter erupts as one villager, wearing a shirt inside out, declares the wind, just a fancy air conditioner that broke. By dusk, the villagers stand in a patchwork armor of layered clothing, each layer hugging their bodies like a stubborn lover refusing to let go. The cold still gnaws, but now it feels more like an irritating mosquito than a lethal predator. Mara looks at her shawl, now tucked beneath a thick woolen coat, and realizes that a single bright thread cannot brave a winter that wants to write its own epic. The lesson settles over the highlands like a warm ember. Survival is a stack of humble pieces, not a single flashy banner. And as the night deepens, the wind sighs, perhaps humbled by the village's improvised fashion show, while Torun hums a tune that sounds suspiciously like the theme from a medieval video game. The first frost arrives like an unwelcome courier, slapping the thatch roofs with icy fingers and turning the once green meadow into a white shroud of silence. Sheep huddle, their breath puffing out like tiny steam engines, while the wind howls through the timbered walls, rattling the old iron pots like an overcooked kettle. Peasants stare at the endless snow, their eyes glazed over like a medieval version of a Netflix binge watch, only the show is called Winter, the endless edition. Even the church bells seem to sigh, their clang muted by layers of snow that mutter back in a muffled, damp echo. In this frozen tableau, the night stretches long enough to make anyone wonder if time itself has been put on ice. With the granaries sighing under the weight of dwindling grain, the village elder hoists a wooden spoon like a scepter and declares a rationing council. Each family receives a thimbleful of flour, enough to bake a biscuit that could double as a snowball, hard, dry, and surprisingly satisfying when you fling it at a mischievous sparrow. Mothers knead the dough with gloved hands, the scent of wheat mingling with the sour bite of winter air, while children gnaw on crusty bits like they're chewing on ancient scrolls of survival. The peasants learn to stretch every crumb, turning porridge into a slurpy, broth-like experience that warms the belly and the soul in equal measure. Even the village's resident jester jokes that their meals are so thin they could be used as paper for love letters to the next harvest. When the wind whistles through the bare branches, a few brave hunters slip into the forest, their breath frosting the pine needles as they stalk the few hares that have not fled the cold. Their bows creak under the weight of frost-bitten arrows, and each shot sounds like a tiny pop culture bang. As if a medieval version of the movie, The Hunger Games, were being reenacted with squirrels as tributes. The cold makes the animal's fur stand on end. A prickly coat that smells of pine resin and damp earth. And when a rabbit finally falls, it lands with a soft thud that echoes like a muted drumbeat. The hunters split the meat among the huts, the rich, coppery scent of blood mingling with the smoky hearth, while the rest of the village watches from the windows, mouths watering despite the numbness. Though the hunt is scarce, the irony is clear. Even the fiercest predator can't outrun a frosty pantry. So every bite is celebrated like a victory over a dragon named hunger. To keep the bellies full, the peasants march to neighboring hamlets, their boots squelching through slush as they barter a sack of oats for a bundle of smoked fish. Essentially medieval Amazon Prime, if you will, only slower and with more mud. The exchange takes place under a sagging timber awning, where the smell of brine battles the aroma of stale rye, and both parties grin, knowing that a single trade could mean the difference between a full belly and a night of gnawing on icicles. A lanky mule, its coat coated in a glaze of frost, carries the goods back, its ears flicking like antennae picking up gossip about the Lord's new tax. Another reminder that even in winter, politics never freezes. Children giggle as they swap cheap trinkets, shiny stones, cracked shells for a single warm loaf, a microtransaction reminiscent of buying a loot box for a surprise snack. The whole affair is punctuated by an old beggar's chant, Winter's Grip, more like Winter's Grip Tote, a rhyme that sticks in the cold air like a stubborn snowflake on a woolen scarf. As the night deepens, the cold slips through every crack, creeping into beds like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave until the sunrise. Breath becomes visible clouds inside the humble huts, and the scent of damp wool mixes with the metallic tang of feverish sweat from those battling hypothermia. Coughs echo off stone walls, each hack sounding like a drum roll before the inevitable finale. Illness that spreads faster than a medieval meme about dragon breath. The village healer, armed with bitter herbs and a mug of hot cider, chants prayers louder than a rock concert, trying to coax the bodies back to warmth while the fire crackles, its flames licking at the air like a dragon's tongue. By dawn, the survivors, cheeks rosy from the chill and the effort, raise their mugs in a toast to the cold that tried to claim them, laughing as they say, "Next winter, we'll just move to the tropics. Just kidding. We'll keep drinking cider anyway. When the first frost settled over the valley, the night turned black as a coal-stained monk's habit. Breath puffed out in ghostly ribbons, and the wind rattled the thatch like a drunken drummer. Even the village dogs shivered, their fur standing on end like a field of pine needles. The peasants huddled by the central hearth, eyes wide, listening to the creak of old stone as it sighed under the weight of ice. Somewhere, a rooster dared a late crow, only to be silenced by a gust that sounded like a medieval trombone. Mara, the village's unofficial fashionista, seized the moment and spun wool into cloaks thicker than a Netflix binge. She layered each stitch like a strategic game of Tetris, fitting one fleece over another, until the garment resembled a fluffy, moving snowdrift. The men grunted approvingly, dubbing the new attire the coat of many warm hugs, while trying not to look like overstuffed turkey. Children giggled as the cloaks brushed the ground, sending up tiny clouds of lanolin perfume that could rival a Viking sauna. By morning, everyone wore a portable hug that could survive a polar bear stare. Meanwhile, old Tomas trekked to the granary, hauling bundles of golden straw that smelled of fresh hay, and a whisper of mouse droppings. He wedged the stalks into the cracks of the stone walls, creating a fluffy barrier that whispered nope to every icy draft. The walls, now padded like a medieval couch, muffled the wind's howl into a sleepy lullaby. Occasionally, a mouse would squeak from its new hideaway, prompting a startled shout that sounded like a squeaky medieval accordion. The peasants swore the straw kept their blood from turning into a frozen lake, and the scent of earth-kissed wheat lingered in their throats like a rustic perfume. When the wind proved more persistent than a gossiping bard, the villagers piled mud, twigs, and whatever debris lay handy into low earthen berms around the homestead. These windbreaks rose like clumsy cousins of the Great Wall, every grain of soil shouting, "You shall not pass, frost." Children dumped puddles on the new barriers, watching the mud splash like a medieval splash screen. The scent of wet earth rose, mixing with the smoky perfume of the hearth, a combo that could wake the dead, or at least the village's resident lazy cat. By sunset, the wind's voice was a muffled mutter, as if the night itself had been shushed by a giant's hand. As darkness deepened, Father Aldrich clambered onto the low stone throne well, a sturdy crate, and raised his hands, his voice cutting through the night like a sword of hope. He recited prayers that sounded suspiciously like a medieval remix of a modern anthem, whispering, "Winter is coming, but we shall not freeze." The villagers bowed, eyes closed, feeling the warmth of collective belief seep into their bones, as if faith were a portable heater. Laughter bubbled from the back when a goat accidentally knocked over a candle, only to be saved by a hastily raised prayer and a soggy blanket. By dawn, the peasants rose with cheeks rosy from cold and morale, ready to face another frosty day, convinced that ingenuity and a good sermon could melt even the hardest ice. The night cracked open like a shattered egg, and a ferocious blizzard surged over the village, ripping thatch from roofs with a sound like 1,000 wolves gnawing on straw. Snow hammered the windows so hard that old Aldrich swore the wooden panes were auditioning for a role in a medieval demolition derby. The great hearth in the communal hall sputtered, then coughed its last ember, leaving a cold that crept up the backs of every peasant like an unwelcome guest at a banquet. Breath frosted in the air, turning every spoken word into a momentary sculpture of ice, while the wind sang a howling chorus that could have scared a banshee into early retirement. Aldrich, eyes as sharp as a hawk's, thrust his hands into the cold and rallied the villagers, shouting, "Gather round, you scurvy souls, or we'll all be museum specimens." He shoved a massive log onto the ruined hearth, coaxing a reluctant flame to roar back to life, its orange tongues licking the soot-blackened stones. Around the resurrected fire, people clutched their cracked mugs, sharing the last of the salted pork that had been curing for months, each bite tasting like a relic from a more generous winter. Laughter cracked through the chill as the eldest woman, Gertrude, compared the situation to that one episode of Game of Thrones where everyone dies in a snowstorm. Except we're not nobles. We're just trying not to freeze our noses off. The meat, dry and salty, released a perfume of desperation that mingled with the acrid scent of ash and the sweet, sharp sting of pine sap clinging to the wind-blown clothes. Faces flushed rosy from cold and the heat of the fire. Eyes glittered like frozen beetles, each villager swapping stories of past winters like trading cards. Even the usually stoic blacksmith, Bruni, whispered a joke about forging swords out of icicles, prompting a chorus of chuckles that rattled the iron shutters. Yet beneath the humor, a nervous tremor ran through the crowd, for they all knew the blizzard would not cease until the moon itself grew tired. When the fire began to wane, Aldrich declared a daring trek to the distant monastery, perched like a stone sentinel on the hill. The only place rumored to still have supplies that hadn't been turned into snow sculptures. He handed a ragged shawl to little Tomas, who shivered as if his bones were auditioning for a drum solo, and whispered, "Don't look like you're trying out for a medieval cosplay contest. We need to stay alive, not look good." The group slipped into the howling gale, their boots crunching through waist-deep drifts, while the wind roared like an angry dragon that had just discovered it had a cold. They clutched each other's cloaks, occasionally slipping on ice, each tumble accompanied by a slapstick yelp that could have been lifted straight from a slapstick cartoon. Yet the monk's bell rang in the distance, a hopeful clang that cut through the storm like a knight's sword through parchment. At last, they staggered to the monastery's stone gate, where the breviary reading monk opened the doors, eyes widening at the sight of frost-bitten peasants clutching the last of their meat like a trophy. The monks, ever the charitable, handed out warm broth that smelled of carrots, onions, and a hint of holy redemption, and offered dry blankets that felt softer than a dragon's sigh. Aldrich, eyes glinting with relief, offered the monks a piece of the pork, which they accepted with a solemn nod, remarking that even saints need a good snack after a night of divine wind. The villagers settled into the monastery's great hall, the fire roaring louder than ever, and the howl outside turned into a distant lullaby. As the night finally released its grip, the peasants realized that surviving a blizzard was less about strength and more about sharing a laugh, a fire, and a stubborn refusal to become a frozen footnote in history. When the last gale finally sighs, the black sky cracks open like an overcooked eggshell, letting a shy sun drip gold over frozen fields. The ice that had clung to the thatch roofs shivers and slips, leaving puddles that smell of iron and pine sap. Villagers emerge, their breath still misting, eyes squinting at the new-born light that makes the snow sparkle like spilled sugar. Children, cheeks pink as cured ham, chase each other across the thaw, slipping on slick mud and shouting, "Winter is over." Like a medieval tick-tock, even the old shepherd, whose beard has seen more winters than a Netflix series, has episodes, chuckles. Well, that's one more season canceled. With the thaw comes a scramble. The peasants haul charred timbers from the ruined barn, their hands raw and smelling of sawdust and sweat. Women hammer nails into fresh beams, while men stack firewood, the rhythmic thud echoing like a tavern drumbeat. A ragged rooster crows atop a newly repaired roof, its crow sounding suspiciously like a medieval alarm clock. They trade recipes for stews. One neighbor offers a pinch of nettle, the other a secret stash of honey, like bartering in a secretive Game of Thrones kitchen. By sunset, smoke curls from chimneys, painting the sky with a comforting amber haze that whispers, "We've got this." Early spring sowing begins, the peasants scattering seed like confetti at a coronation, each grain a tiny promise of tomorrow's bread. The soil, damp and smell of petrichor, pulls the kernels into its embrace, while beetles skitter like tiny, disgruntled court jesters. A lanky lad drops a sack of barley, and the plump kernels roll into a puddle, creating a mess that makes the onlookers grin and mutter, about spilling the kingdom's wealth. Elders chant old lullabies, their verses rising above the rustling stalks, turning the field into a choir of wind and whispers. By the time the sun dips low, the rows of tender shoots sway, resembling a sea of green swords ready to defend the village from hunger. The community gathers around a massive bonfire, stoking it until flames lick skyward like a dragon on a budget. They raise mugs of mulled ale, the bitter aroma mingling with the sweet scent of roasted chestnuts, causing an involuntary smile that could melt even the toughest frostbite. Storytellers spin yarns of prior hardships, sprinkling each tale with jokes about how the Lord's winter wardrobe looked like a medieval version of the Emperor's new clothes. Laughter erupts when someone impersonates the village priest's solemn sermon, turning it into a comedic TED Talk about the power of shared blankets. The night ends with a chorus of "We Survived," echoing across the fields, a melody louder than any battlefield drum. As dawn cracks again, the peasants stretch, feeling the lingering heat of the fire settle like a warm cloak around their shoulders. They realize that while swords and armor may protect a castle, cooperation, a clever mind, and a sprinkle of faith are the true shields against the coldest nights. The farmer who once worried about winter's bite now hums a tune he swore he'd never sing again. Don't Stop Believin', albeit in a guttural medieval dialect, with soil under nails, fire in bellies, and hope in hearts. They step forward, ready to face any storm that dares to return. And so the village stands, not just warmed by a hearth, but by the fierce glow of shared humanity, a glow no frost can ever dim. The valley of Eldenbrook lay swaddled in a quilt of fresh snow, each ridge sparkling like a field of powdered sugar. Frost-bitten wind whistled through the timbered roofs, rattling shutters with a mischievous chuckle that sounded oddly like a sitcom laugh track. Inside the stone-capped chapel-like hall, villagers scraped together last scraps of firewood, their breath forming ghostly clouds that vanished as quickly as a Snapchat story. The sun had long since taken a vacation, and darkness crept in like a cat burglar hunting for warmth. Tonight marked the longest night of winter, a night when even the moon seemed to pause and stare, wondering why humans insist on making a mess of their own fires. Mara, the village's seasoned hearthkeeper, stalked the hearth like a seasoned director prepping a cast. She cupped her arms around the shivering children, whose cheeks glowed crimson from the cold and from the anticipation of stories. With a grin wider than a farmer's barn door, she whispered that the fire would be as stubborn as a Netflix binge watcher refusing to hit stop. The kids huddled, ears tuned to the crackle of embers that sounded like popcorn popping in a medieval microwave. Mara's voice rose, telling tales of how the first embers saved the village from a wolf pack that smelled nothing but fresh stew. The lanky shepherd Tomas trotted in, dragging a sack that hiccuped with every step, as if the wood inside were complaining about the journey. He dumped the last bundles onto the cold stones, the pine needles releasing a scent so sharp it cut through the stale air like a blade through butter. A stray goat, clearly unimpressed, chewed on a stray log and left a trail of drool that smelled like old cheese and ambition. Tomas grinned, declaring the wood battle ready, and promising it would keep the frost at bay longer than a superhero's cape lasts in a spin cycle. The children squealed, half in awe, half because Tomas accidentally set off a tiny avalanche of twigs that fell like confetti at a royal wedding. Mara struck the flint, sending sparks flying like fireworks on the 4th of July, only colder and more medieval. The kindling caught with a roar that made the hearth sigh, then heaved a warm breath that painted the walls with dancing orange shadows. The fire's heat swelled, licking the stones, coaxing the cold out of the villagers' bones, as if a giant hug from a yeti had just been delivered. The scent of burning wood mingled with the sour tang of horse sweat and the faint perfume of a baker's rye, creating an aroma that could convince even a dragon to pause its feast. Laughter erupted as someone shouted, "Winter is coming, but we've got the best Netflix binge in town," and the phrase stuck, echoing off the timber beams. As the night deepened, the communal fire became the village's beating heart, its glow a promise that darkness could be tamed with shared warmth. Mara watched the children's eyes flicker with the same amber light, realizing that the fragile peace rested on a simple truth. Ember-lit stories outshine any sword. Tomas, now perched beside the hearth, sang a low ballad that sounded suspiciously like a medieval remix of All Star, causing a few elders to roll their eyes while secretly tapping their toes. The fire crackled on, throwing sparks onto the snow outside, which hissed like a startled cat when the heat brushed its icy fur. And in that moment, Eldenbrook knew that survival wasn't just about hoarding wood, but about gathering souls around a single, stubborn flame. The wind howls like a stray wolf across the thatched roofs, and the village hearth sputters, a stubborn orange bead against the night. Children huddle in woolen cloaks, their breath fogging the low beams as they listen to the crackle that sounds like gossiping grandmothers. The smell of damp pine and burning tallow mingles with the sour tang of spilled ale, filling the great hall with a fragrance that says survival, not romance. Elders sit on rough benches, eyes flickering like the flames, recalling summer's bounty, while the cold presses its icy fingers through every doorframe. Yet even as the fire casts warm shadows, a thin line of tension draws itself across the floorboards, as thin as a spider's silk. By the time the last log was reduced to charcoal, the villagers began arguing over who would brave the frost-bitten woods for fresh timber. Old Tom, whose beard could double as a broom, claimed the right of seniority, waving his gnarled staff like a royal scepter. Young Marta, cheeks reddened by more than blushing, shouted that the younger hands should fetch the wood, lest the elders waste their breath on complaints. Voices rose, clashing like steel on an anvil, and the sound of heated debate mingled with the distant howl of wolves rehearsing a choir. The dispute thickened, as stubborn as the soot that stained the villagers' shirts, threatening to smother the very fire they all depended on. Into this frosty fracas stepped Aldrich, a newcomer with a grin wider than a tavern door, and a coat that smelled faintly of burnt sugar. He brandished a crude map and declared a shortcut through the frozen forest, promising to shave hours off the timber trek if the trees didn't bite back. The elders, clutching their ceremonial birch wands, countered that ancient rites demanded a pilgrimage around the lake, where spirits whispered, "Don't be late." Their debate spiraled into a parody of a medieval council meeting, complete with exaggerated hand gestures that would make a Shakespearean actor jealous. Behind them, the communal fire flickered, as if rolling its eyes at the human drama, throwing sparks that sounded suspiciously like tiny applause. A gaggle of villagers whispered that Aldrich's shortcut sounded like a cheat code from a video game, a warp pipe, straight to the timber depot. Yet the forest ahead was a white labyrinth of twisted branches, smelling like a mix of burnt marshmallows and the after effects of a goat's dinner. When the first brave soul ventured out, her boots squelched in knee-deep snow, producing a squishy symphony that would make the Minecraft soundtrack blush. Meanwhile, the elders muttered incantations that sounded oddly like the lyrics to an old folk ballad. Don't go chasing fireflies on a winter night, a line no one could actually locate in any known tome. The irony was palpable. A community built on shared warmth now teetered on a comedy of errors, where the biggest threat was a misstep, not an invading army. As the night deepened, the fire roared higher, casting golden halos on weary faces and coaxing a reluctant truce. Aldrich, humbled by the chorus of cracked jokes, agreed to accompany the elders on the ceremonial route, promising to bring back timber and perhaps a squirrel trophy for good measure. The villagers laughed, their doubts melting like butter on hot iron, and a chorus of voices rose, some chanting, some singing the stairway to heaven on a lute, because why not, with logs stacked like a fortress and hearts warmed by shared stories. The communal blaze burned brighter than any dispute could ever dim. In that moment, the village truly gathered, proving that even when tempers freeze, the hearth's glow can melt enough to keep everyone snug and secretly a little bit heroic. The winter wind howled like a banshee, cracking the hearthstones beneath the village's cottages with a sound that sounded suspiciously like a bad Wi-Fi connection. Folks huddled around the dying embers, eyes narrowed as they swore they heard a rustle in the pines. Rumor had it a forest spirit was on a stealing fire spree. The cold seeped into bone and broth alike, frosting the wooden beams until they squeaked in protest. In the dim glow, old Marta muttered a prayer that sounded like a medieval version of "May the Force be with us," hoping the spirit would be as merciful as a Jedi. By morning, the village looked like a scene from a post-apocalyptic kitchen show. Half-melted cheese on the floor, soot-stained faces, and a chorus of coughs that could rival a chorus of drummers. Women scrambled for kindling, digging through straw piles that smelled of wet hay and unwashed goats, while children shivered, clutching cracked wooden toys like lifelines. The communal fire sputtered, throwing up sparks that vanished faster than a politician's promise, feeding the growing dread that the night would swallow them whole. Fear rose like the smoke, thick and acrid, and every creak of the roof sounded like a footstep of the invisible thief. Enter Tomas, the village's unofficial fire wielder and self-appointed hero, whose beard was as tangled as the forest itself. He remembered a secret stash of dry pine hidden beneath the old oak behind the mill, a stash older than his grandmother's gossip column. With a grin that said, "I'm about to channel my inner Indiana Jones," he bundled up in a woolen coat that smelled of fermented cabbage and set off into the frosty gloom. The wind slapped his cheeks, but Tomas kept his eyes on the prize, whispering a prayer to Saint Christopher and the occasional "Do not let me die, but do let me find that pine." The trek was a slapstick nightmare. Tomas slipped on an icy patch, sending his boot flying like a bad movie prop, and landed face first into a mound of excrement-laden duck droppings that stunk like a medieval latrine after a feast. He shuffled through bristling brambles that scratched his arms, each thorn shouting, "Ouch," louder than his own doubts. Yet, when he finally unearthed the pine, the scent of resin hit him like a superhero's entrance theme, sharp, sweet, and promising salvation. He hoisted the bundle, its dry needles crackling softly, and raced back as if the village's future depended on his sprint speed, which, thankfully, it did. Back at the hearth, Tomas tossed the pine onto the reluctant flames, and they leapt to life with the enthusiasm of a dragon discovering a new treasure hoard. The fire roared, sending embers dancing like tiny fireworks, while the villagers cheered louder than a tavern full of bards after a winning duel. The forest spirit, apparently unimpressed by their drama, slipped away as silently as a cat meme disappearing from a timeline. Warmth washed over the cottages, melting frost from windows and cheeks alike, and Tomas was crowned figuratively, of course, with a wreath of twine and a freshly baked loaf that smelled of butter, honey, and a hint of triumph. The moon hung like a frosted coin over the thatched roofs, and the wind whistled through the narrow lanes of Alderford as if the village itself were shivering. Children huddled by cracked shutters, their breath frosting the glass like tiny ghosts. In the great hall, Mara knelt beside the dying hearth, feeling the last embers sigh like a tired cat. The scent of damp straw and cold ash filled the air, a reminder that even the strongest wood can groan under winter's stare. Yet something crackled in her eyes, a spark of resolve that promised the night would not win. For weeks the villagers had whispered in separate corners, each family clutching its own firebrand like a selfish secret. The baker cursed the flour that refused to rise. The blacksmith muttered about rust, and the herb woman warned of frostbite on her fresh roots. A vague specter of division swirled above the rooftops, colder than the wind, feeding on every sigh of discontent. When the communal hearth sputtered out, the village felt the night's teeth gnawing at the very marrow of their homes. Mara sensed that the chill was not just temperature, but a betrayal of the ancient pact that bound them around a single flame. She rose, slapped a dusty tarp from the hearthstone, and shouted, "Gather every log, every ember, and every prayer now." Men and women hurled splintered oak, pine needles, and even a few smelly cheese rinds into the pit, the latter causing a brief, pungent protest from the children. The clamor rose like a medieval tick-tock, each voice echoing off stone walls, while a stray goat bleated a bass note that startled the choir. Hands trembling, they stacked the timber in a crooked pyramid, each piece a piece of their stubborn pride forced into cooperation. Mara lifted her voice, leading a chant that threaded the smoky syllables of Merry Hearth. Hold us fast, into a rhythm as steady as a drumbeat in a battle march. The chant swelled, and the piled logs shivered, catching fire as if a dragon had sneezed into the pile. Flames erupted, orange tongues licking the night sky, while a sudden roar roared louder than the tavern's worst ale-spilling song. Heat surged, roasting the damp earth, and sending up a heady perfume of sap and singed wool that made the villagers gasp in delighted shock. Sparks danced like fireflies on a rave, and the cold spectre recoiled, hissing away like a disgruntled cat chasing a laser pointer. The glow painted every face with amber, turning furrowed brows into wide-eyed smiles as the night's oppression melted away. When the last shiver faded, the village stood shoulder to shoulder around the blazing hearth, their shadows mingling in one fiery silhouette. Laughter cracked louder than any oaken beam, and even the grumpy blacksmith cracked a joke about finally getting a hot update for his forge. Mara, blinking through the heat, felt the ancient promise rekindled, a pact that no winter, no quarrel, could ever truly extinguish. The night, now a mere backdrop, whispered in the wind, "You did it," as if the stars themselves were applauding from above. And so, beneath that roaring blaze, the villagers learned that unity, like a good fire, needs every log, every ember, and every ridiculous, heartfelt chant to keep the darkness at bay. When the first gust of winter slipped over Eldenbrook, the central hearth roared to life like a dragon that had just swallowed a keg of mead. Orange tongues licked the stone, sending sparks that smelled of pine sap and burnt cheese. Villagers shuffled in their woolen cloaks, cheeks flushed from the cold and the heat, eyes bright as polished amber. The fire's crackle stitched a rhythm into the night, a drumbeat that coaxed even the most stubborn goats to wander closer. In that glow, Eldenbrook seemed to shrug off the season's bite and stand taller, as if the flames had forged a new armor of confidence. Around the blaze, old Marta began to spin a tale of the town's founder, her voice rising and falling like the flickering flames. Children leaned in, their noses tucked into the smoke, catching hints of roasted chestnuts and the musky odor of wet wool. Each story was a stitch in a renewed tapestry of tradition, tying the present to ancestors who once whispered over similar embers. A drunken minstrel cracked a joke about a knight who mistook the fire for a dragon and ended up with a singed beard, sending eruptions of laughter that bounced off the timber walls. The night grew thick with camaraderie, the communal fire acting as a storyteller's microphone, amplifying every laugh, gasp, and sigh. Tomas, the blacksmith's apprentice with soot under his nails, nudged Aldrich, the shy shepherd who feared fire more than wolves. Aldrich's hands trembled as he lifted a lump of charcoal, but Tomas laughed and declared it was just the universe's version of a sauna, prompting the boy to grin. As the heat pressed against their faces, the two swapped stories, Tomas bragging about a hammer that sang like a rock star, Aldrich boasting of a goat that could moonwalk. Their banter sparked a bond stronger than the iron Tomas shaped, and by the time the embers turned to ash, the pair were as inseparable as a pair of mismatched socks on a cold morn. The villagers raised their mugs and shouted, "May their flame never flicker," a toast that echoed like a medieval meme. Word of the nights, revelry spread like soot on a windbeam, ensuring that each winter thereafter would gather around the same hearth. Elders vowed to keep the fire burning through the longest nights, feeding it with pine bark, oat straw, and the occasional daring experiment involving cheese wheels. The glow became a classroom where children learned math by counting sparks, and lovers exchanged vows that smelled faintly of smoked herring. Even the village's stray cats, usually aloof, curled up in the smoke, purring as if they'd just discovered a new Instagram filter. In this way, the communal fire stitched itself into the very DNA of Eldenbrook, promising warmth for generations, as reliable as a Netflix binge on a stormy evening. As the night waned and the last ember dwindled to a shy glow, the villagers lingered, their hearts full of shared memory. Tomas and Aldrich stood side by side, eyes reflecting the dying light, promising to tend the fire together whenever the frost grew fierce. The air carried the lingering scent of burnt wood and fresh hope, a perfume that would cling to Eldenbrook streets for years to come. When spring finally brushed the hills, the hearth would be rebuilt, each log laid with a story, each spark a reminder that community burns brighter than any single flame. And so, the embers of memory flickered on, a timeless beacon for anyone who dared to gather round a fire and laugh at the absurdity of life. The valley sits like a bowl of soup, its cliffs cradling a patchwork of amber fields that have just surrendered their last fruits. As the sun dips, peasants haul in the final bundles of squash, carrots, and the stubborn cabbage that refuses to wilt without drama. Their breath fogs the crisp air, and the rustle of stalks sounds like an old record scratching at the edges of a winter lullaby. Laughter erupts when little Janko trips over a wayward turnip, sending it rolling like a runaway golf ball. In that moment, the harvest feels less like duty and more like a daring feast before the freeze. Elder Marta, with hair as white as the salt she's about to sprinkle, gathers the crowd around a wooden barrel that smells like the sea after a storm. She lifts a sack of coarse sea salt, its grains glittering like tiny snowflakes under the fading light, and declares, "We'll turn these veggies into edible time machines." The peasants lean in, eyes wide, as she rubs the brine into beet skins, coaxing a salty perfume that makes even the wind pause to sniff. With each pinch, Marta tells a story of ancestors who survived harsher winters by mastering the art of preservation. A tale as crunchy as the carrots they now cure. By the end, everyone is licking their fingers, half laughing, half wincing at the salty tang that feels like a tongue-tingling high five from history. When twilight deepens, Marta lights a pit of hardwood, and the smoke rises like a dragon's sigh, curling over the hanging racks of pork and trout. The crackle of flames sings a low baritone, while the peasants fan the ember with wooden spoons, turning the ritual into a smoky ballet. Ironically, the scent of smoked meat reminds them of distant city taverns where gossip travels faster than a gossip goblin on a skateboard. Yet, here it's pure survival as the meat darkens to a mahogany hue. Marta jokes that the smoke is the valley's own Wi-Fi, connecting each villager to the promise of tomorrow's dinner. By the time the fire dies down, the air is thick with a perfume that could make a grown man weep. And then hunker down for a bite. Next, Marta leads the troop to the earth-cooled cellars, where roots are tucked into blankets of straw that smell like damp laundry left in a swamp. The temperature down there is as steady as a medieval thermostat set to freeze your toes, perfect for slowing rot and keeping potatoes from turning into mushy nightmares. She explains, with a wink, that this underground pantry is the original cold storage. No electricity, just good old-fashioned geology doing the heavy lifting. The peasants press their hands against the cool walls, feeling the stone's steady heartbeat. And one whispers that they're basically living inside a Jurassic Park fridge, only with fewer velociraptors and more carrots. The rustle of buried vegetables becomes a lullaby of hope, promising a table of nourishment when the snow finally buries the village in white. As the night deepens, the villagers gather around a crackling hearth, plates piled high with salted carrots, smoked trout, and root veg that have survived the cold's whisper. Marta raises a mug of sour cabbage broth, toasting to the ancient art that turned scarcity into a banquet. And the crowd erupts in cheers louder than a medieval market's haggling chorus. The feast feels like a victory lap for every calloused hand that dug, pried, and preserved. Proof that ingenuity can outlast any blizzard. In the glow of the fire, faces shine with the warm, greasy glow of contentment, and even the wind outside seems to pause, as if to sample the aromas drifting up the valley. With bellies full and spirits high, the peasants realize that the harvest of hope isn't just the food on their plates. It's the shared knowledge that together they can turn winter's bite into a seasoned, savory story. The first snow fell like a thief in the night, stealing the green sigh of the wheat fields and replacing it with a crisp, silvery silence. Frost crept up the stalks, turning each blade into a glassy needle that snapped under a child's boots. The air smelled of pine sap and the sharp bite of iron, a reminder that the season had switched its coat without asking permission. Farmers pulled their shawls tighter, eyes squinting as they watched the horizon dim to a wintry gray, the kind of gray that makes you wonder if the sky is about to ask for a raise. Even the crows seemed to mutter, "Cold, cold," in a language only the wind could translate. By midday, the village square resembled a haunted pantry, empty sack after empty sack laid bare like the souls of exhausted cows. Mothers pressed their palms to their bellies, feeling the hollow echo of another day without broth, while the children's stomachs growled louder than the church bell. The community's storage barrels, once brimming with grain, root veg, and honeyed jam, now hissed under the weight of expectation. Each creak a reminder that winter was not a polite guest, but a demanding landlord, old Tomas, who could smell a rotten carrot from 3 fences away, whispered that the frost had robbed them of more than just warmth. It had robbed their very patience. Yet a stubborn flicker of hope lingered, like a candle fighting the draft of a drafty barn. Tension cracked like ice on the river when the barrel of pickled cabbage, the prized, sour treasure of the harvest, was uncovered. 2 brothers, Jerk and Milo, lunged for it as if it were the last Jedi lightsaber, shouting, "Winter is coming, and I need my greens." The dispute quickly turned into a chorus of curses and accusations, each villager taking sides like they were voting for the best game of Thrones house, except everyone wanted the cabbage, not a throne. Even the town's goat, who usually chewed silently, bleated in protest, adding a comedic soundtrack to the heated barter. The barrel, half full and sweating brine, seemed to sigh, "You've got to share the love, or I'll turn to mush." Elder Hilda stepped forward, her cane tapping a rhythm that reminded everyone of the harvest drums they'd once celebrated too. She spoke of the long days when the sun hung low, and the peasants all labored side by side, turning soil into sustenance with calloused hands and cheeky songs about spare the cabbage for the winter. Her voice, warm as a hearth, cut through the frost-bitten argument, reminding the crowd that trust was the glue that held the thatch roofs together. "Remember," she chuckled, "we survived the plague, the drought, and that rogue band of traveling minstrels who stole our ale, so we can survive a barrel of cabbage." Laughter, gritty and raw, rippled through the crowd, easing the tension like warm broth melting a frozen crust. In the end, the barrel was split, each spoonful measured like a promise, and the villagers ate together, slurping the sour leaves with gusto, while their breath formed little clouds of triumph. The taste of the cabbage tangy, salty, with a hint of mustard that slapped the palate, was a reminder that preservation was more than a technique. It was a lifeline woven from sweat and patience. A young boy raised his cup of fermented milk, toasted the sky, and declared, "May our winter be as short as a TikTok video." The comment sparked giggles, and the night swelled with stories of the past, the crackle of fire, and the comforting knowledge that, even when the world turned white, community kept the hearth glowing. As the first stars pierced the cold veil, the peasants whispered thanks to the earth, the snow, and that stubborn barrel of cabbage that saved them from becoming winter's footnotes. Young Tomas trudged up the wind-scarred hill, his boots squelching in the thaw-soft mud that still smelled of damp straw. He had heard old wives whisper about a cold cavern that swallowed winter's whole, but most thought it was a story to keep children from stealing the firewood. When his lantern's beam fell on a moss-covered stone arch, the ground gave a hollow thud, like a bad joke waiting for a punchline. He knelt, brushed away centuries of leaf litter, and uncovered a yawning stone doorway that breathed a faint, bracing chill. The air tasted of iron and ancient snow, and Tomas felt the thrill of a kid who just found a secret level in a medieval video game. Marta, the village's unofficial survival guru and self-appointed queen of pickled beet jokes, arrived with a sack of carrots and a grin wider than a barn door. Together, they pushed the massive slab aside, exposing a cavern lined with rough flagstones slick with frost that clung like a shy cat to a windowsill. The inside smelled of earth and ice, a scent that would make any modern refrigerator weep with jealousy. Marta laughed. Looks like the ice age never left. Just got a new lease on life. No Netflix required. Their flashlights flickered, casting dancing shadows that turned their own silhouettes into a medieval version of a horror movie trailer. They recalled the old method of burying root vegetables in insulating snow, a trick as old as the hill itself, and as clever as a fox stealing chickens. Tomas shoved a heap of turnips, potatoes, and beetroot into a snow-packed trench, patting it down like a grandpa tucking a grandchild into bed. The snow crackled under their palms, cold enough to make a squirrel shiver, while the earthy perfume of raw tubers rose like a promise of winter supper. Marta whispered, "If this works, we'll have enough food to keep the Lord's men from raiding our pantry." Talk about food security, medieval style. They sealed the cache with a layer of packed snow, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like a marching band on a frosty battlefield. Word of the hidden ice house spread faster than gossip about a noble scandal, and soon the village's hungry souls gathered at the hill's foot, eyes glittering like fresh frost. When the first carrots were unearthed, their orange skins shone against the white snow, as if the sun itself had been boiled into a veggie. The taste was crisp, sweet, and a little gritty, like chewing on a memory of winter that had survived centuries of neglect. Laughter erupted, and even the stoic blacksmith cracked a smile, muttering, "Who needs a castle's pantry when you've got an ice house?" It's the original cool spot. The cache promised to turn the tide of famine, giving the peasants a fighting chance against hunger, and perhaps a new legend to brag about at the tavern. As night fell, Tomas and Marta sat on a stone ledge, sipping warm broth while the wind whispered through the cavern like a tired storyteller. They imagined future generations staring at sleek refrigerators and wondering how ancestors survived without humming magnets and blinking screens. The ice house, once a forgotten relic, now pulsed with life, its icy breath a reminder that ingenuity often hides beneath the most unassuming snowdrifts. In a twist of irony, the peasants' cool storage was colder than any modern gadget, yet it cooked up a warmth that no electricity could match. They raised a battered wooden cup, toasting the frozen stone and the stubborn spirit of those who never let a little frost stop a hearty feast. The wind howled like a chorus of angry goats as the blizzard slammed the thatched roofs of Koldov. Snow piled against the wooden doors until they creaked like old hinges, surrendering to the cold. Inside, candles sputtered, casting jittery shadows on walls plastered with faded folk art. The villagers huddled in their woolen shawls, cheeks pink as beetroot, while the storm outside wrote its own epic on the sky. Even the village dog, Borscht, shivered so hard his tail turned into a snow globe. Days stretched into a white-washed nightmare, and the pantry began to whisper of emptiness. Little Anya, who could sniff out a hidden stash like a truffle pig, remembered the ice house, a secret cellar carved into the permafrost centuries ago. They hauled stone slabs aside, revealing a frosty cavern that smelled of ancient pine and stale dampness. Inside glimmered rows of smoked fish hanging like chandeliers, barrels of fermented beets, glowing a lurid violet, and sacks of honeyed grain that clinked like coins. The cold air bit their noses, but the promise of food warmed their spirits. The first bite of the smoked fish cracked like a record needle, releasing a plume of amber smoke that curled around everyone's faces. Fermented beets hit the tongue with a sour punch, a tangy reminder that the earth could survive a freeze and still throw a party. Honeyed grains melted sweetly, coating tongues in golden goo that made the old baker grin like a kid who just found a secret level in a video game. Even the grimmest farmer, who usually wore a scowl thicker than his beard, found himself humming a jaunty tune. This beats any feast at the Iron Throne, the young lad shouted, earning a chorus of chuckles as bowls clanged and mugs sloshed. Stories rose like steam from a kettle. Tales of heroic harvests, of love lost to a stray goose, of the mayor's infamous dance moves that could rival a tick-tock challenge. The storm outside roared, but inside the ice house, the only thunder was the collective belly laugh of a community fed and fortified. Neighbors who'd never exchanged more than a nod now passed plates hand to hand, their eyes sparkling with the kind of camaraderie usually reserved for battlefield truces. A stray cat, fur matted with frost, hopped onto the table, eyeing the fish like a medieval knight eyeing a dragon's hoard, prompting an improvisational cat song that would make a minstrel blush. By the time the last morsel vanished, the blizzard had turned from tyrant to a tired spectator, and the villagers felt as invincible as a squad of avengers after a power-up. When the wind finally sighed and the snow receded, the village emerged like characters from a winter comic strip, cheeks flushed and stomachs full. They patched roofs, shoveled paths, and celebrated the survival with a dance that mimicked the swirling snow, arms flailing, feet slipping, everyone laughing at their own clumsiness. The ice house doors were sealed again, its treasures refrozen, ready for the next white siege. Old tales of the frostbound feast spread to neighboring hamlets, turning the secret pantry into a legend whispered over muggy brews. And so the season's lesson rang clear. A well-preserved stash is the medieval equivalent of a smartphone battery, essential, life-saving, and oddly comforting when the world freezes. When the ice finally surrendered to the sun, the river that had been a frozen ribbon of disappointment melted into a sluggish, sludgy stream that smelled like cold laundry left out too long. Villagers peeled themselves from their straw-warmed huts with the enthusiasm of a cat discovering a fresh tuna tin, shaking off frost like dandruff. Children squealed as puddles turned into impromptu mud wrestling pits, while the elders huddled under tarps, eyeing the thaw with the wary optimism of someone checking the expiration date on a jar of pickles. The air tasted of wet earth and promise, a fragrant reminder that the next chapter of survival was about to be written in the furrows of the fields. With spades in hand and the memory of last winter's gnawed bones still fresh, the peasants turned to the soil as if it were a reluctant lover they had finally convinced to dance. They planted barley, beans, and rye. Each seed whispered into the ground like a secret promise to the ancestors who taught them how to hide cabbage in the cold for weeks. The communal cellar doors creaked open, releasing a cloud of sour, tangy perfume from jars of fermented beets that could make a grown man weep either from nostalgia or the stench. It was hard to tell. Laughter rang out as old Marta tried to sell a sack of dried mushrooms to a skeptic, quipping, "It's like the original fungi for your stomach. No Wi-Fi needed." By midday, the fields resembled a checkerboard of hope and mud, each plot a tiny battlefield where hope wrestled with the lingering dread of scarcity. The villagers swapped stories of frost-bound feasts, recalling how they'd survived a week on fish that smelled like a forgotten gym bag, yet somehow tasted like triumph. They joked that the fermented herring was the medieval equivalent of a superhero's power-up, calling it the Odin of appetizers. while a teenager tried to convince his grandmother that the smelly cheese could be the next big thing on TikTok. Even the wind seemed to chuckle, rustling through the sprouts, as if the very earth were giving a standing ovation to their perseverance. By the 7th day, the first green shoots broke through the crusty soil with a stubborn vigor that reminded everyone of a video game character emerging from a loading screen. The seedlings stood like tiny soldiers, their bright leaves glinting with dew that smelled faintly of fresh rain and rebellion. A farmer's wife, wiping sweat from her brow, muttered, "Look, they're sprouting faster than my brother's meme career," eliciting a chorus of good-natured snorts. The crisp snap of seedlings as they were gently brushed aside filled the air, a sound as satisfying as the pop of a freshly opened soda can in a summer heat wave. As the sun dipped low, casting amber shadows over the budding rows, the community gathered around a crackling fire to toast the successes of the day, and the lingering aromas of winter's saved provisions. The lingering scent of fermented cabbage mingled with the fresh perfume of new growth, an olfactory reminder that survival is a cocktail of the old and the new, like a medieval smoothie, if you will. With each bite of preserved turnip and each hopeful glance at the seedlings, they affirmed that frost-bound feasts were not just a means to survive, but a cultural tether pulling them through the bleakest winters. In that moment, the peasants felt as invincible as the heroes of a saga, knowing that the next harvest would be a tribute to the stubborn spirit that refuses to let winter have the final word. When the wind howled like a drunken banshee across the valley, Mara huddled over her loom, fingers numb but stubborn. The snow lay thick as flour on the ground, and the villagers muttered that a coat of wool was a fantasy reserved for kings. Undeterred, she swore to stitch together a wardrobe that could survive a night without a hearth. Her eyes sparkled with the same ferocity as the crackling fire she hoped to replace. She called the project Weaving Warmth, half joking that it might finally make her the medieval version of a Patagonia jacket. First, she slashed coarse linen from the old grain sacks, the fabric smelling of spilled ale and field rot. Next came strips of elk hide, still slick with the musk of fresh kill, which she boiled until the grease peeled away, leaving a leathery skin that squeaked when tugged. Between these layers, she spun a yarn from the sheep she'd rescued from a frozen stream, its fibers as soft as a cat's whisper, yet thick enough to trap heat. Mara tucked the wool inside the linen like a secret pocket, then draped the hide over it, creating a 3-stage armor against the bite of ice. The whole contraption cracked and creaked as she tried it on, sounding like a distant accordion playing a funeral march. When Mara strutted into the communal hall wearing her patchwork prototype, The elders stared, as if she'd walked in wearing a superhero cape made of garbage. Old Joran scoffed. What's next? A cape that makes you fly to the moon. The younger hunters snickered, comparing the tunic to a medieval version of a woolly Wonka outfit. Yet a few curious eyes lingered on the way. The hide brushed against the linen, emitting a faint, comforting warmth that tickled the nose. Mara answered their doubts with a grin, daring anyone to test the tunic on a child during the night hunt, promising no frostbite, only fabulous fashion. The moon hung low, a silver pancake, as the hunt party slipped through the pine forest, breath forming ghostly ribbons. Little Ira, shivering in a thin shroud, clutched Mara's layered tunic like a life raft. When a sudden gust slammed frost into her cheeks, the wool belly of the tunic puffed out, sealing heat like a zip-up in a video game chest. Ira's fingers, previously turning blue as bruised berries, stayed pink, and she giggled at the ticklish rustle of hide rubbing linen. The others, eyes wide as owls, whispered that Mara had just turned a potential tragedy into a warm-hearted sitcom episode. By dawn, the snow glittered like powdered sugar, and the hunters returned, cheeks flushed, praising the tunic's uncanny ability to fend off the cold. Mara, elbow deep in a pot of pine tar, declared the experiment a triumph, though she admitted the hide still smelled like a musk-filled gym locker. She laughed, noting that if the village ever needed a fashion line, she'd call it Sub-Zero Chic, complete with a tagline: Stay cool, stay warm. The skeptics, now sipping warm broth, conceded that layering wasn't just a medieval myth, but a practical art, as stubborn as a mule, but twice as warm. And so, with a modest success sewn into the fabric of the community, Mara prepared her next design, dreaming of a coat that could survive a blizzard and a dragon's breath alike. The first frost of the season arrived like a thief in night clothes, stealing heat from every thatch and leaving the village shivering in its wake. Mara watched the children huddle in mismatched shirts, their noses red as boiled beetroot, and felt the sting of a raw wool shortage gnawing at her ribs. The old women whispered that winter was getting meaner, their breath fogging the air like ghostly candles. Mara clenched her fists, her mind spinning a plan as sharp as a whetted blade. It was time to turn desperation into action, even if it meant stepping into the snow-soaked unknown. At dawn, Mara gathered a ragtag band of peasants, each clutching a sack of stale rye and a flickering torch that danced like mischievous fireflies. They slipped past the ridge toward the shepherd's valley, where flocks grazed under a bitter sky that smelled of wet horsehair and pine resin. With a sudden roar, the villagers surged forward, scattering the sheep like startled popcorn The shepherd's bell rang out a frantic alarm that echoed across the hills. The raid sparked a chorus of angry shouts from the neighboring clan, their voices cracking like ice on a frozen pond. Ironically, the thieves left behind a trail of wool as tangled as a sitcom plot twist, while the shepherd cursed the wind for stealing his livelihood. While the raid raged, Mara crouched beside a fire, mixing pine sap, bear fat, and a splash of river amber into a greasy paste that smelled like toasted marshmallows gone rogue. She slipped the oily concoction into the raw fur of the captured lambs, massaging it until the fibers glistened like slick armor. The resulting fabric swelled with a soft heft, repelling water as stubbornly as a cat avoids a bath. Mara laughed, waving the new hybrid cloth in the cold wind, proclaiming, "If you think wool can't survive a snowstorm, you've never tried a fur oil combo." The villagers cheered, their cheeks flushing with a pride hotter than the stove they'd lost to the blizzard. News of the raid spread faster than gossip in a tavern, and the neighboring clans stormed the village gates, brandishing spears that clanged like kitchen knives on a sheet metal roof. The clash sounded like a percussion ensemble gone berserk. Metal thuds, shouted curses, and the occasional squeak of boots on ice. Mara's hybrid garments proved their worth, slipping off the attackers' arms like greasy fish, rendering their grip useless. Amid the chaos, an elderly storyteller shouted a rhyme that sounded suspiciously like a line from an ancient saga. Winter is coming, but we've got the ultimate anti-freeze jacket. The irony was thick. A war sparked over wool, now fought in slick, oil-soaked armor. When the sun finally rose, the battlefield lay quiet, strewn with trampled snow, broken spears, and the faint scent of burnt pine. The villagers, wrapped in their new moisture-defying cloaks, stood victorious, their breath forming celebratory puffs that looked like tiny fireworks. Mara, cheeks smeared with soot, and a grin as wide as a river, declared the day a triumph of ingenuity over scarcity. She toasted the night's events with a mug of spiced mead, joking that if the gods had a fashion line, it would be called Fur Oil Fusion, the ultimate winter wear, now featuring extra swagger. The tale spread across the hills, becoming legend, and every winter thereafter the peasants whispered, "Never underestimate a girl with a pot of oil and a plan as wild as a fast and furious chase through snow." When the northern blizzard rolled in, it brought not just snow, but a wall of white that swallowed the village whole. The sky turned a jaundiced gray, and the air smelled of iron and frozen pine sap as the wind slashed the thatched roofs. For 14 relentless days, the villagers huddled in their cabins, listening to the howl that sounded oddly like 1,000 angry cats. Food stores dwindled, and morale slipped lower than a sled with no runners. Yet in the midst of this frozen chaos, Mara tightened the straps on her patchwork cloak and whispered, "Time to test the layers." Mara's garment was a tower of textiles, each stitched like a medieval IKEA flat pack. A woolen base, a fur-lined middle, a wax-coated outer shell, and a detachable hood that could double as a makeshift yak milk soup bowl. Torin, ever the pragmatic tailor, added pockets bolted with iron buckles that jingled like a dragon's treasure when he moved. They marched through the village square, the fabrics hissing as they brushed against the biting air, releasing a faint scent of smoked lamb that reminded everyone of summer barbecues. Children giggled, believing the layers were a fashion statement from a futuristic runway, while elders muttered that the clothes were as stubborn as a mule on a mountain pass. The duo laughed, their breath frosting into glittering clouds, as they prepared to lead the desperate crowd across the frozen river. The river, once a lively ribbon of water, now lay frozen like a giant crystal slab, cracking ominously beneath every step. Mara slipped on a pair of leather boots lined with elk hide, each footfall sounding like a drumbeat against a drum circle of yetis. When the first villagers' boots cracked through the thin ice, the multi-layered cloaks acted like thermal armor, repelling the frost that tried to creep under the seams. Torin shouted encouragement, his voice echoing off the ice cliffs, while the cloaks shimmered with a faint amber glow, as if the sun itself were trapped inside. The villagers moved as a sluggish but determined convoy, the cold biting at their noses, the smell of wet wool and pine resin filling their nostrils. Halfway across, a scream ripped through the howling wind. Little Anya, the baker's daughter, had slipped into a fissure where the ice had given way like a broken promise. Panic erupted, and for a heartbeat, the whole river seemed to freeze in terror. But Mara didn't falter. She threw her heavy, fur-lined cape over the crevasse, the fabric swelling like a superhero's cape in a Pixar movie, and pulled with a strength born of countless winters. Torin, brandishing a rope woven from goat hair, lowered it down, and together they hoisted the shivering child, whose cheeks were as red as winter roses. As they dragged her to safety, the crowd erupted in cheers louder than a tavern brawl, while a stray snowflake landed on Mara's nose, melting instantly like a dramatic Hollywood melt. When the blizzard finally relented, the sun peeked out, turning the snow into a glittering carpet fit for a coronation. The villagers gathered around a crackling fire, the scent of roasting chestnuts mixing with the lingering smell of frostbite and triumph. Mara's layered garments, now speckled with ice crystals and a few stray gooseberries, stood as a testament to human ingenuity against nature's worst mood swings. Torin joked that the cloaks could survive a sequel to Game of Thrones. Winter is coming indeed, but now they had the perfect wardrobe. As night fell, the villagers sang songs of the great ice trial, their voices warm and ragged, promising that next winter they'd add a pocket for hot cocoa to those legendary layers. When the ice finally gave way to a trembling spring, the valley exploded in a chorus of clanking pots and shouted cheers. Mara stood on the cracked riverbank, her eyes bright as sunrise, as the last frost melted into a stinking, earthy brew of mud and pine sap. Around her, villagers lit bonfires that hissed like angry dragons, sending plumes of smoky rosemary into the chill air. Children chased each other through puddles, slipping on the sour-smelling glop, while old men toasted with fermented beet juice, a beverage that tasted like victory and regret rolled together. The whole scene felt like a low-budget medieval Woodstock, and everyone knew this was no ordinary celebration. It was a proof that their patched-together lives could still outrun the cold. Mara's new layered garb, stitched from repurposed sheepskin and the bark thin weave of spruce, quickly became the village's unofficial uniform. Each piece snapped and crinkled with a satisfying pop that reminded the wearer of popcorn kernels exploding under a winter sky. She called the ensemble the frost-proof fashionista, a tongue-in-cheek nod to runway shows she'd only ever seen on flickering tavern walls. The villagers slipped into the coats and felt an immediate warm hug, as if a bear had offered its own belly as a blanket, minus the fur ball odors. Even the grizzled blacksmith, who usually scoffed at anything softer than steel, admitted that the layers were as essential as his hammer, and twice as stylish as his old chainmill. Word spread faster than a blizzard through a hayloft, and soon the entire settlement was threading, weaving, and huffing over piles of rawhide like cats on a hot roof. Mara taught them to sandwich a thin woolen undercoat between a rugged leather shell and a lofty fur mantle, a sandwich so insulating it could keep a frozen heart beating like a drum. Elder Neela, who could smell a leaking pipe from 3 cabins away, whispered that the new style made the cold feel like a mildly annoyed ghost rather than a murderous specter. Irony dripped from the scene. The very people who once shivered while hunting rabbit tails now strutted in outfits that could survive a polar vortex without a single goose step. The laughter echoed off the thawing stone walls, and even the wind seemed to pause, curious about the sudden burst of color and warmth. Among the eager faces, a lanky youth named Tobin clutched a ragged yarn ball, eyes wide like a Jedi apprentice staring at a lightsaber for the first time. Mara guided his trembling fingers through the fleece, showing him how to fold the inner layer so it would trap heat like a secret pocket of sunshine. The scent of tanned hide mixed with the sour tang of fresh meltwater, making Tobin's nose crinkle, as if he'd just inhaled a goat's breakfast. He fumbled, got his stitches tangled, and burst into a fit of giggles when the fur cuff flopped over his nose like a drunken rabbit. Mara chuckled, remarking that the best survival skill was the ability to laugh at one's own frosty mistakes, because a smile could thaw even the toughest of blizzards. When the sun finally settled into a lazy summer slant, the village draped itself in Mara's layered legacy, each person a walking, breathing snow shield. The apprentice's hands, now calloused and confident, tightened a final knot, sealing the coat with a whisper of promise that the next generation would never freeze out of fashion. A distant howl of wolves turned into a background soundtrack, reminding everyone that the world beyond the valley still bit cold, but their threads held firm. Mara looked on, her grin as warm as a hearth, and thought of the ancient tales where heroes wore nothing but bravery. She just added a really good coat to the mix, and so the story of sub-zero survival stitched itself into the very fabric of the community. A tale told around fires for centuries, each retelling as snug as a freshly sewn seam. The valley lay like a frosted bowl, its cliffs swallowing the sun until the sky turned a perpetual pewter gray. Aldrich, a wiry farmer with hands as rough as the quarry rock, stared at the wind howling through his timbered cottage as if it were a particularly angry kettle. Snow piled up faster than a teenager's Instagram followers, burying the fields and the village's optimism beneath a crust of icy misery. Each night, the hearth coughed out a thin plume of smoke that smelled like burnt pine and desperation, while the family huddled under blankets that smelled faintly of goat cheese and yesterday's dinner. The elder, old as the legends carved into the stone walls, shuffled forward with a grin that hinted at mischief, and a stash of ancient schematics in his sack. He unfurled a parchment as creaky as a medieval piano and whispered, "Behold, the secrets of the snowbound shelter, older than any kingdom's crown." The ink depicted walls layered like a lasagna, each slab of stone separated by a blanket of straw, a technique that trapped heat the way a cozy blanket traps a cat. He explained that the roof needed a steep pitch, a design that would fling snow off like a medieval catapult launching a rubber duck at a castle. And the chimney, he added with a twinkle, must be as narrow as a wizard's wand, so the draft pulls the fire upwards and not sideways into your dinner. The villagers listened, their eyes widening like they'd just seen a dragon in a supermarket aisle. Aldrich's family set to work, hauling rough-hewn stones from the riverbank, their breath forming white ghosts that danced in the frigid air. They packed the gaps between stones with compacted hay, a smelly but effective insulator that kept the cold out and the warmth in, much to the delight of the village mice, who promptly moved out. The roof, rebuilt with overlapping wooden shingles nailed at a daring angle, sang a sharp clatter whenever a snowflake dared to cling, sending it tumbling down with a satisfying thud. Inside, they repositioned the hearth to the heart of the house, centering it like a sun in a medieval solar system, and added a low, stone bench for the family to sit close to the fire's embrace. The smell of burning oak mingled with the faint perfume of wet wool, creating an aroma both comforting and vaguely reminiscent of a medieval spa day. As the wind hammered against the newly fortified walls, Aldrich felt a warmth blossoming in his chest that rivaled the feeling of finding a pocket full of silver coins in a dung heap. The children giggled while roasting marshmallows over the fire, their sticky fingers leaving sweet, caramel-kissed prints on the stone floor, a mess the elder called modern art with a wink. Even the family dog, a shaggy mutt named Brutus, rolled in the soot, emerging with a grin that suggested he'd just conquered a dragon, if dragons smelled like burnt wood and pine resin. The night outside crackled like a distant battle, yet inside, the cottage hummed with the low murmur of a contented fire, the scent of broth, and the distant echo of the elder humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like the anthem from a famous space saga. Aldrich laughed, realizing that the ancient tricks were not just practical, but also a perfect excuse to throw a winter party that would make even a court jester blush. When spring finally whispered its tentative promise, the snow melted away, leaving behind a home that still radiated the faint glow of its winter triumph. The village elder leaned on his staff, eyes twinkling, and declared that Aldrich's cottage now stood as a beacon for all who faced frost, like a medieval version of a modern-day superhero lair. Aldrich, clutching a steaming mug of broth, felt the irony of surviving the cold thanks to techniques older than his great-grandfather's great-grandfather. He raised his mug in a toast that echoed through the valley, promising to teach any visitor the art of snow shove fencing, a term he coined for flinging snow off roofs, much to the delight of the local bard, who promised a ballad titled The Frosty Fortress. The tale of their snowbound shelter spread far and wide, ensuring that next winter even the fiercest blizzard would be greeted with a grin and a well-insulated hearth, proving that old wisdom and a dash of humor can outlast any frost. When the wind howled like a chorus of disgruntled goats, Aldrich the mason master whistled a sharp call that echoed through the village square. He rounded up his band of burly masons, each with hands calloused from years of chipping stone, and a grin as stubborn as the granite they loved. Their mission was simple yet vital: to fortify his humble cottage against the relentless snow that piled higher than a tavern's keg on market day. Aldrich waved a feather-light wooden mallet as if it were a conductor's baton, syncing the crew's rhythm to the beat of hammer on stone. Even the village chickens seemed to pause, clucking in approval as the first slab was set in place. The walls rose, thick as a dragon's hide, each layer of limestone laid with a mortar laced with packed straw and earth, a recipe that smelled faintly of cow dung and fresh hay. The masons tamped the mixture like bakers folding dough, ensuring no cold drafts could slip through the cracks. Aldrich joked that the cottage would now be so insulated that even a winter-weary monk could nap in the pantry without shivering. The sound of stone hitting stone rang out, a deep thud that resonated through the frosted air like the heartbeat of the hill itself. By twilight, the cottage looked like a stone bear, stout and immovable, daring the next snowfall to test its resolve. Meanwhile, the rest of the hamlet turned their attention to the rooftops, swapping steep, pointy peaks for low, sloping silhouettes that resembled giant, buttery croissants. These new roofs spread outward, their overhanging eaves flirting with the sky, ready to catch snowflakes before they could pile into dangerous avalanches. The villagers strapped bundles of pine sap to the rafters, creating a natural, sticky glide that helped the white load slide off with a sigh. Children watched, eyes wide, as the snow streamed off the edges like melted ice cream, and they squealed, "Look, it's a snow slide for the roof." Even the local blacksmith, who usually grumbled about extra labor, admitted the design would keep his forge roof from caving in like a poorly built Lego tower. As night fell, the cottage exhaled a warm, yeasty aroma from the hearth, mingling with the sharp bite of frozen pine that seeped through the cracks. The wind rattled the new eaves, a rattling chorus that sounded eerily like a medieval drumline, keeping the villagers on edge, yet oddly comforted. Inside, the packed straw released a faint, earthy perfume, reminding Aldrich of harvest festivals and the occasional surprise of a mouse that thought the insulation a 5-star hotel. Outside, each snowflake landed with a soft plop, then was instantly shunted sideways by the roof slickness, creating a hushed, shuffling sound like a massive, invisible cat walking on velvet. The whole scene felt like a medieval version of a Netflix binge watch, cozy, slightly chaotic, and impossible to look away from. By the time the moon rose, the villagers gathered around Aldrich's cottage, raising mugs of spiced ale and chanting a jaunty version of "Winter is coming, but we've got good roofs." They toasted to stone that could outlast a dragon's sneeze and roofs that shed snow faster than a Hollywood stunt double evades explosions. Aldrich, with a wink, declared the project a triumph of common sense over superstition, noting that the only thing more stubborn than the new walls was his mother-in-law's opinion on paint colors. Laughter rang through the frosty air, cracking like ice on a pond, while the newly fortified cottage stood stoic, its stone belly humming with the low growl of the hearth. And so, the village learned that, when the heavens dump their white loot, a clever blend of stone, straw, and sloped roofs could turn even the harshest blizzard into a backstage rehearsal for comfort. The wind arrived like an angry druid, slamming shutters and hurling shards of ice across the thatched roofs. By twilight, the village lay under a white blanket, so thick it swallowed the church steeple hole. Inside the modest farmhouse of the Hartholds, the hearth sputtered, casting an orange glow that could barely compete with the storm's pale glare. Mara, the matriarch, slammed the heavy oak door behind her, only to hear a hollow whine as the cold slipped through like a sneaky thief. The blizzard had sealed the world outside, turning every threshold into a potential portal for frostbite. The house boasted the newest trend in medieval architecture, a narrow, double-leaf door that looked sleek but behaved like a drafty accordion. When the twins tried to push the panels open, the hinges squealed louder than a court jester with a broken lute. Each leaf, barely wide enough for a sack of grain, acted as a wind tunnel, funneling icy gusts straight into the parlor. Even the recessed entryway, intended as a modest shelter from rain, proved to be a shallow pit, where cold gathered like unwelcome guests at a banquet. Mara's nose twitched at the sharp, metallic tang of frozen air, a scent more fitting for a dragon's lair than a humble cottage. We built this to keep the rain out, not to invite the Arctic, Mara muttered, watching her breath form ghostly ribbons in the doorway. Her son, Tomas, tried stacking barrels against the door, but the barrels slipped like embarrassed peasants in a mud fight. The family soon realized the double-leaf design was a thermal villain, swapping warm room air for the kind of bite that makes your teeth chatter louder than a medieval tavern band. In a flash of ironic inspiration, they recalled a legend of a Viking longhouse that used a windbreak, essentially a hallway that said, "Nope, not today, cold." The idea sparked, and they set out to turn misfortune into a makeshift vestibule, as if installing a bouncer at the door of a nightclub. With rough pine planks they built a small cubby, a wooden throat between the front door and the hearth, nailed together with hammered urgency that echoed like a blacksmith's applause. Inside the new vestibule, they hung heavy curtains sewn from sheepskin pelts, the fur soft as a kitten's back, but as thick as a dragon's hide. The curtains swayed, muttering, rustling whispers that reminded the children of enchanted tapestries from a wizard's market stall. Mara lit a modest tallow lamp at the far end, and its buttery glow chased away the lingering chill, making the space smell of melted beeswax and old leather. Even the dogs barked approvingly, their noses twitching at the warm, musty scent that tasted like victory over the blizzard's tyranny. The vestibule performed like a medieval airlock, trapping the fury of the storm outside, while the inside stayed as cozy as a hobbit's hobnob spot in the Shire. If hobbits wore woolen cloaks and ate pottage, soon the family could sit around the hearth without their teeth clacking like castanets in a marching band. Neighbors knocked on the newly fortified door, their faces pale, but eyes bright, as if they'd just seen a medieval version of the Star Wars, Death Star's blast doors. Only this one kept the cold at bay. The Heartholds laughed, sloshing ale that steamed like a dragon's breath, and toasted the cleverness that turned a design flaw into a fortress of fluff. And as the storm finally waned, the village emerged, still coated in snow, but with one doorway that now whispered, "Come in, you're welcome, but keep the frost where it belongs." The night sky turned a bruised violet as snow hammered the thatched roofs, turning the village into a white-washed bunker. Ice clanged against the wooden shutters like a rogue percussion section in a medieval orchestra. Inside the cramped hall, lantern light flickered, casting jittery shadows that danced on walls plastered with soot and stray bits of straw. Mothers hushed crying infants, while the eldest brother slammed the door shut, sealing out the gale's ferocious breath. Even the family dog, a scruffy mutt named Brutus, shivered and barked at the howling wind, as if it were a terrible karaoke rendition of a dragon's sneeze. At the heart of the chaos stood the reinforced stone hearth, a hulking slab of basalt that looked like a mini mountain forged by a blacksmith with a flair for drama. Around it, a shallow pit was packed tight with damp clay, its earthen walls slick as a mudslide after a rainstorm, ready to cradle the firewood like a cozy womb. A clever smoke vent system, essentially a primitive chimney crafted from hollowed oak and wrapped in woven reed, snaked upward, guiding the gray plume out through a tiny roof aperture, lest the house turn into an indoor sauna for the local swine. The hearth's iron door, dented from previous battles with stray sparks, creaked open, inviting the first logs to tumble in with a satisfying thud. As the flames licked the stone, a sudden crackle sounded like an impatient audience member demanding a pause in the performance. Heat radiated from the basalt like a medieval furnace on steroids, seeping through the thick stone walls and coaxing the frozen air into a reluctant sigh. The family gathered close, cheeks pink from the glow, while the neighbor's gaunt grandmother slipped a woolen shawl over her shoulders, muttering that this warmth felt like a dragon's hug, minus the fiery bite. The scent of burning pine mingled with the sharp tang of wet fur, and the faint, comforting odor of the old goat cheese stored in the loft, creating a stew of aromas that could wake a hibernating bear. Laughter, rough and guttural, bubbled up as the children told tall tales of knights and trolls, each story amplified by the crackling chorus of the fire. Even the storm outside seemed to respect the hearth's dominion, its wind dying down to a reluctant whisper against the sturdy timber beams. Meanwhile, the village's resident fool, a lanky lad named Joran, who swore he'd seen a Netflix series about Viking ship battles, tried to convince everyone that the hearth was actually a portal to a secret realm where pizza never gets cold. He gestured dramatically toward the flames, shouting, "If this were Game of Thrones, the Iron Throne would be a fireplace, only less dramatic and more useful for toasting marshmallows." The irony was not lost on the eldest son, who retorted that the only thing hotter than their fire was the village gossip about the Lord's new tax, which, like the smoke, rose fast and lingered longer than anyone liked. A sudden sneeze erupted from the eldest daughter, sending a spray of soot across the table, prompting a chorus of groans that sounded like a choir of disgruntled bats. Yet amid the jokes and the occasional accidental face full of ash, the hearth's steady beat kept everyone grounded, like a reliable Wi-Fi signal in a world of analog chaos. When dawn finally broke, the storm had spent its fury, leaving behind a glittering carpet of snow that sparkled like powdered sugar on an ancient cake. The stone hearth, now blackened but triumphant, continued to glow faintly, as if winking at the survivors for a job well done. The family emerged, cheeks rosy, boots squelching in the slush, carrying bundles of firewood as trophies of the night's endurance. Neighbors arrived, clapping the young father on the back and declaring his hearth the true hero of the village, a knight in stone armor that never needed a sword. And so, with bellies full of warm broth and hearts buoyed by the night's shared warmth, they sang a low hymn to the hearth, celebrating the simple truth that when the world goes cold, a good fire can be more legendary than any dragon. When the thaw nudged the river awake, the village burst into a chorus of creaking doors and clanking tools. Children chased puddles, while elders huddled around the freshly lit hearth, swapping stories of the night. The snow piled higher than a dragon's back. The air smelled of damp earth and wet wool, a reminder that winter had finally loosened its grip. With cheeks flushed from cold and effort, the masons unfurled parchment to record the tricks that had saved their roofs from becoming white tombs. In that bright, muddy dawn, they vowed to ink every successful adaptation for the generations that would follow. First came the thick walls, a fortress of stone and timber that swallowed the wind like a giant swallowing a howl. Builders stacked layers of rough-hewn oak, then plastered them with lime mixed with ash, creating a warm cocoon that smelled faintly of burned bread. When the wind tried to slip through the cracks, it met a barrier as stubborn as a mule refusing a carrot. Inside, the walls radiated a faint, comforting heat that made the cold bite feel more like a nudge. Even the mice seemed to approve, scurrying along the baseboards with a satisfied squeak. Next, the roofs were given a slope steep enough to make snow slide off like a sled on a water slide, only less squealing and more shivering. Thatched thatch, now layered with reeds, formed a honey gold blanket that rustled under the wind, sounding like an ancient accordion playing a mournful tune. When the snow finally settled, it streamed down the angles in silvery ribbons, splattering like popcorn on the courtyard stones. Villagers joked that the roofs were so slick, even a Game of Thrones dragon would struggle to land without slipping off. The scent of fresh pine needles lingered, mingling with the faint odor of smoke from the hearth below. The vestibule, or as some called it, the snow trap hallway, served as a humble airlock between the howling outside and the cozy interior. Each footstep echoed against packed mud, the floor sticky with melted snow and the occasional stray goose feather. When villagers shrugged off drifts, the vestibule caught the flurry, turning it into a chaotic pile of frosty socks and half-forgotten mittens, an accidental sculpture of winter's leftovers. A stray whiff of wet fur and pine resin floated through, making the air feel like a forest after a rainstorm. Yet the space was priceless, keeping the central hearth from becoming a smoky sauna for the whole village. At the heart of every home burned a massive hearth, its flames dancing like medieval tick-tock stars, bright enough to chase away the darkness and the lingering smell of damp wool. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward like tiny fireworks that whispered promises of warmth to the weary. Grandmothers narrated legends while stirring the pot, their voices mixing with the scent of stew, herbs, and charred wood. Once the story was finished, a scribe dipped his quill into ink dark as midnight and traced the lessons onto vellum, sealing them with a wax sigil shaped like a snowflake. This communal manuscript, thick with humor and hindsight, would guide future builders to craft shelters that could outlast even the fiercest winters.